100 warriors stand super still in the early morning gray light. Their faces painted for battle, but their weapons stay hidden away. They make a perfect circle around an old, empty trading post, quiet like rocks, just waiting. Inside, a homeless boy who shared his only blanket with a native baby is shivering, not knowing that his future is being decided by people who watched him all through the dark night. Tobias. Crow pressed his back against the rotting wooden wall. His 12-year-old body was shaking from the cold that cut through his worn-out clothes like knives. The baby in his arms had stopped crying hours ago, wrapped cozy in the wool blanket that had been Tobias's only shield against the tough frontier. Nights. His lips were blue, his fingers numb, but the child was warm. He thought he was going to die. The idea came not with scary feelings, but with a weird calm. He had picked his path when he found the tiny bundle left alone near the creek, ditched to freeze by someone mean or hopeless. The blanket had been his dad's once, the last link to a family that lived only in blurry memories. Now it was for this baby whose dark eyes looked up at him with trust he didn't earn. The sound of footsteps on frozen ground made his heart stop. Not the heavy boots of the traders who sometimes passed through, but the soft, careful steps of moccasins. Lots of moccasins. Tobias held his breath, hugging the baby closer, feeling the child's small heartbeat against his chest, like a scared bird. Through the gaps in the wooden planks, he saw them. Tall figures moving with purpose, their shapes sharp against the pale morning sky. Wore paint, feathers, the shine of steel tomahawks, catching the first bits of sunlight. They surrounded the building completely, a human wall of muscle and intent. The baby made a soft cooing sound, and Tobias quickly placed his hand over the tiny mouth, his own breathing shallow and panicked. He had heard stories about what happened to white children, found in native territory, stories that ended with screams and smoke and silence. But as he watched the warriors take their positions, something felt wrong about those stories. They weren't attacking. They weren't even moving. They were just waiting. A figure emerged from the group, taller than the rest, wearing a headdress of eagle feathers that caught the wind. The man's face was painted with white and red stripes, his expression unreadable as carved stone. He carried no weapon in his hands, only a small leather pouch that he held carefully, almost reverently. The leader's eyes found the exact spot, where Tobias was hiding, as if he could see through wood and shadow and fear. Their gazes locked through the gap in the planks, and the man slowly raised his hand, not in threat, but in something else entirely, something that made no sense. He was showing respect. The baby stirred in Tobias's arms, making tiny sounds of hunger, and the boy realized that whatever was about to happen would change everything he thought he knew about survival, about enemies, and about the price of kindness. But first, he needed to understand why 100 warriors had come for a homeless boy and a baby he had tried to save. The leader took a single step forward and spoke one word in English that made Tobias's world turn upside down. "Brother?" As the word hung in the freezing air like smoke from a dying fire. Tobias felt his chest tighten, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. The warrior chief stood 15 feet away, his painted face showing no emotion. That single word had carried more weight than 1,000 threats. The baby shifted in Tobias's arms, tiny fingers grasping at the wool blanket that had once belonged to his father. The child's skin was warm now, no longer the deathly blue it had been when Tobias found the bundle by the frozen creek. He had saved a life, but he still didn't understand why that mattered to these warriors who could have killed him a dozen times over. Sterling Rhodes. Though Tobias didn't know his name yet, reached into the leather pouch at his waist and withdrew. Something small and dark. He held it up for the boy to see through the gap in the wooden planks. It was a piece of cloth, faded and worn, but unmistakably cut from the same wool as the blanket now wrapped around the baby. Tobias's heart hammered against his ribs. His father had always told him the blanket was special, woven by his mother, before the fever took her, but his father had never mentioned that pieces of it might exist elsewhere, in the hands of people he had been taught to fear. The chief's voice carried across the morning stillness, speaking in his own language to the warriors surrounding the trading post. Tobias caught fragments of English mixed with words he didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. These weren't the sounds of men planning violence, were the sounds of men showing reverence. 3 warriors stepped forward, each carrying something in their hands. The first held a bundle of dried meat wrapped in soft deerskin. The second carried a small pouch that steamed in the cold air, filling it with the rich scent of warm broth. The third warrior, a woman with intricate braids and kind eyes, held a tiny cradle board decorated with beads and feathers. Iris Quaid. The baby's mother had been searching through the night with the rest of her tribe. When they found the trading post surrounded and learned what the homeless boy had done, she wept tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Tobias pressed his face closer to the gap in the wood, watching as the woman approached the building. She moved with the careful steps of someone who understood that everything balanced on the edge of a knife. When she spoke, her English was clear and gentle. She said, "The child you hold is my son. He gave him life when death was certain. By our laws, this makes you family." The boy's mind reeled. Family. The word felt foreign on his tongue. A concept he had abandoned when the last relative turned him away 3 summers ago. Yet here were strangers speaking of bonds and brotherhood, of debts that transcended the color of skin or the language of prayers. But something in the woman's voice suggested this wasn't the end of the revelation. There was more to this story. Something deeper that connected his father's blanket to these people, who treated him with a respect he had never experienced. The chief raised his hand again, and this time his words made Tobias's blood run cold. He spoke of a promise made long ago, a debt that had waited 15 years to be repaid, and a truth about Tobias's father that would change everything the boy thought he knew about his own identity. The sound of approaching horses shattered the sacred silence. Tobias felt the baby stiffen in his arms as hoofbeats thundered across the frozen ground from the east, moving fast and angry. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, he watched the circle of warriors shift, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Sterling Rhodes barked a sharp command in his native tongue, and half the warriors melted into the surrounding brush like smoke. The remaining 50 formed a tighter circle around the trading post, their faces hardening from reverence to readiness. Whatever was coming, they'd been expecting it. Clyde Winslow rode hard into the clearing with 6 armed men behind him, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from lost profit. The trader's eyes swept over the warriors with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything as either useful or disposable. When he spotted the baby in Tobias's arms through the broken window, his expression shifted to something much worse than anger. He dismounted with practiced aggression, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That boy stole property from my trading post. The blanket he's got wrapped around that savage baby belongs to me. Payment for debts his worthless father never settled." Tobias felt the words hit him like physical blows. His father had been a good man, hadn't he? The stories he remembered were filled with kindness and laughter, not debt and desperation. But memory could be a liar, especially when viewed through the eyes of a child who desperately needed heroes. Sterling Rhodes stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Winslow and the trading post. When he spoke, his English was careful and deliberate, each word chosen for maximum impact. The blanket was never yours to claim. It was given freely as payment for a life saved 15 years ago. Winslow's laugh was harsh and bitter. "That drunk died owing me more money than this entire settlement is worth. Everything he owned became mine the day he put a bullet through his own skull rather than face his debts." The words crashed over Tobias like ice water. His father hadn't died from fever or accident as he had always believed. The man who had sung him lullabies and taught him to whittle what figures had chosen death over dishonor, leaving behind a son who knew nothing of the burden he carried. But Sterling Rhodes wasn't finished. He reached into his pouch and withdrew a piece of paper yellowed with age and folded carefully. As he opened it, Tobias could see writing in 2 languages, English and symbols he didn't recognize. "Your father saved my daughter from drowning when she fell through the ice. He nearly died doing it. And when we offered payment, he asked for nothing but friendship. We gave him that blanket as a symbol of brotherhood and promised that if he ever had children, they would be protected as our own." The chief's voice carried across the clearing with the weight of absolute truth. The boy honors his father's sacrifice by saving another child. The debt passes from father to son, but so does the protection. Winslow spat in the dirt, his hand moving closer to his weapon. Pretty words don't pay bills. That boy comes with me along with anything of value he's carrying. You savages can keep your half-breed bastard, but everything else is mine by right. Duh. Warrior Chief's face became a mask of controlled fury. Round the clearing, Tobias could hear the soft whisper of steel being drawn from leather sheaths. The morning air grew thick with the promise of violence, and he realized that his simple act of kindness had awakened something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. But before anyone could move, a new voice cut through the tension. Like a blade.
Oh.
It belonged to someone Tobias had never seen before. Someone whose arrival would force every person in that clearing to reconsider everything they thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the true cost of doing what was right. Marshall. Porter Dale stepped into the clearing with the quiet confidence of a man who had settled more disputes with words than bullets. His badge caught the morning light as he surveyed the scene before him with practiced eyes that missed nothing. Alt. The tension was so thick he could taste it, metallic and sharp like blood on the tongue. Tobias watched from his hiding place as the lawman positioned himself carefully between the two opposing forces. The baby had fallen asleep in his arms, tiny chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of someone who trusted completely. That trust felt heavier than iron, shackles around the boy's heart. Winslow's face twisted with frustration as he recognized the marshal. These two had history, the kind that left scars on both men's reputations. The trader's voice carried the whine of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal loopholes. Said Marshall, "This is a simple matter of debt collection. That boy's father owed me considerable money, and everything he owned passes to me by territorial law. I have the papers right here." Porter Dale accepted the documents with deliberate slowness, his weathered fingers unfolding each page with the care of someone who understood that devils lived in details. As he read, his expression grew darker, the lines around his eyes deepening with each clause and signature. Sterling Rhodes remained motionless, but Tobias could see the warrior chief's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Around the clearing, the hidden warriors waited like coiled springs, ready to act on a single word from their leader. The marshal finished reading and looked up at Winslow with the kind of expression reserved for men who preyed on the desperate. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of federal law and personal disgust in equal measure. Said, "These papers show a debt of $300 for supplies and lodging, but they also show that Thomas Crow worked for you for 2 full years, during which time you paid him nothing, claiming his labor was partial payment toward the debt." Winslow shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving away from his pistol. The man was a drunk. Half the time he couldn't work at all. According to these records, he worked every day except when he was caring for his sick son, a son you threw out of town the day after the funeral, with nothing but the clothes on his back and his father's blanket. Tobias felt his chest constrict as pieces of his past rearranged themselves into a picture he had never wanted to see. His father hadn't been a drunk. He had been a broken man trying to provide for his son in a world that offered no mercy to the desperate. The marshal continued reading, his voice growing colder with each revelation. It says here that Thomas Crow's final wages calculated at standard territorial rates would have totaled $420. By my mathematics, you owe his estate money, not the other way around. The clearing fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through bare branches. Winslow's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again, as his carefully constructed lie crumbled under the weight of legal scrutiny. But Tobias barely heard the financial calculations. His mind was reeling from a different revelation entirely. The marshal had called his father Thomas Crow, but in his earliest memories, his father had always introduced himself by a different name entirely. A name that, if he was right, would explain why these warriors treated him like family, and why Sterling Rhodes carried a piece of his father's blanket like a sacred relic. The baby stirred in his arms, and as those dark eyes opened and focused on his face, Tobias realized that the truth about his identity was about to surface, and it would change not just his own fate, but the delicate balance of power standing in armed confrontation around him. Winslow's hand shot to his pistol as desperation replaced cunning in his eyes. A man with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than a cornered rattlesnake. And everyone in the clearing recognized the shift from legal maneuvering to potential violence. Marshal Dale's own hand moved to rest on his weapon, but his voice remained steady and controlled. He had dealt with desperate men before, and he knew that the wrong word or sudden movement could transform a tense negotiation into a massacre. Sterling Rhodes raised his hand slightly, a gesture so small that only trained warriors would recognize it. Around the clearing, invisible figures shifted position, moving closer to their targets. The chief's dark eyes never left Winslow's face as he spoke in English, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He said, "Your father saved more than my daughter from the ice that day. He pulled 3 children from the frozen creek, nearly dying himself. We offered him gold, horses, anything he desired. He asked only for friendship and a promise that his son would never want for protection." Tobias pressed his face closer to the gap in the wooden planks, his heart pounding as more pieces of his father's hidden life emerged from the shadows. Baby in his arms made soft sleeping sounds, completely unaware that his rescue had awakened secrets 15 years in the making. The warrior chief reached into his leather pouch and withdrew something that made Tobias's breath catch in his throat. It was a small wooden figure carved with expert hands depicting a man pulling children from water. His father had made dozens of similar carvings during the long winter evenings. Always the same scene, always the same expression of determination on the tiny wooden face. Your father never told you his true name because he feared his past would follow him. But Thomas Crow was born as Thomas Standing Bear, son of a white trader and my sister. He was your blood as much as ours, which makes you family by birth as well as deed. The revelation hit Tobias like a physical blow. Half-native blood flowed through his veins, connecting him to these warriors who had surrounded him, not as enemies, but as relatives he never knew existed. His father's strange knowledge of tracking, his ability to read weather patterns, his skill with medicinal plants, all of it suddenly made perfect sense. But Winslow wasn't finished. Cornered and desperate, he drew his pistol with the wild movements of a man who had decided that if he couldn't profit from this situation, no one would survive it. The trader's voice cracked with hysteria as he shouted, "I don't care about your savage family trees or your dead hero stories. That boy belongs to me, and I'll see him dead before I let you take what's mine."
Oh.
The marshal's gun cleared leather faster than seemed possible for a man his age.
Out.
But Winslow had already swung his weapon toward the trading post, where Tobias crouched with the sleeping baby. The boy realized with crystal clarity that he was about to die, and that his death would likely start a war between the warriors and the armed traders. But as he prepared to shield the baby with his own body, expecting the thunder of gunfire to be the last sound he ever heard, something else happened instead. Something that would prove that courage could be found in the most unexpected places, and that the bonds forged by sacrifice were stronger than fear, greed, or the hunger for revenge. The baby opened his eyes at that exact moment, looking up at Tobias with complete trust. And the boy suddenly understood that this wasn't about his own survival anymore. It was about proving worthy of the family he had never known he possessed, and the protection they had traveled through the night to offer him. Iris. Quaid stepped directly into Winslow's line of fire before anyone else could react. The mother of the sleeping baby moved with the fluid grace of someone willing to die for what mattered most, positioning herself as a human shield between the trader's pistol and the boy who had saved her son. Her voice carried across the clearing, with quiet strength that commanded attention from every armed man present. She spoke in English, her words carefully chosen to reach both the desperate trader and the marshal who held the power to prevent a massacre. She said, "You want to shoot a child who gave his only protection to a dying baby? What kind of man does that make you in the eyes of God?" Winslow's hand trembled, but his grip on the pistol remained firm. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cold, and his breathing came in short, panicked bursts. He was a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that his next choice would determine whether he fell alone or dragged others down with him. Marshal Dale seized the moment of hesitation, his own weapon trained steadily on the traitor's chest. His voice cut through the tension with the authority of federal law and the promise of swift justice. He said, "Clyde, you've got 6 witnesses. Here who will testify that you drew first on an unarmed child. Put the gun down and we'll settle this liga. I'll keep pointing it at that boy and you'll hang before the month is out." Behind Winslow, his 6 hired men began to back away slowly. They had signed up for intimidation and simple collection work, not for a shooting war with federal marshals and native warriors. The smart ones were already calculating how far they could retreat before bullets started flying. Tobias felt the baby stir in his arms, tiny fingers clutching at the wool blanket, as if sensing the dangers surrounding them. He thought about his father's sacrifice, about the choice to pull drowning children from icy water, even when it meant risking everything. The courage hadn't skipped a generation. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to surface. Sterling. Rhodes spoke softly to his warriors in their native tongue, and Tobias watched through the gap in the wooden planks as the hidden figures emerged from the brush, like ghosts materializing from morning mist. They didn't charge or threaten, simply became visible, their presence transforming the odds from even to impossible for anyone foolish enough to continue the confrontation. The traitor's eyes darted frantically around the clearing, counting enemies and calculating chances. 50 warriors, 1 federal marshal. It's a growing realization that his hired men were melting away like snow in spring sunshine. His carefully planned intimidation had become a trap of his own making, but desperation made men unpredictable. And Winslow's finger tightened on the trigger as he made a final, fatal calculation. If he couldn't have the boy and the money, he could at least ensure that no one else would benefit from his failure. The shot that rang out across the clearing would be heard for miles, echoing off canyon walls and disturbing wildlife for hours afterward. But when the gunpowder smoke cleared, the person lying motionless on the frozen ground wasn't the one anyone had expected to see. Marshal. Dale's bullet had found its mark before Winslow could complete his trigger pull. The traitor lay crumpled on the frozen ground, clutching his shoulder and cursing through gritted teeth as blood seeped between his fingers. His pistol had discharged harmlessly into the sky when the marshal's shot spun him sideways, the pain destroying his aim in his last desperate gambit. Tobias emerged slowly from the trading post, still cradling the sleeping baby against his chest. The wool blanket that had started this entire confrontation now seemed like such a small thing, hardly worth the violence and revelation it had unleashed. But he understood now that it had never been about the blanket at all. It had been about honor, family, and the debts that passed from one generation to the next. Like precious heirlooms, Sterling Rhodes approached the boy with careful steps, his painted face softening as he saw how gently Tobias held the child. When he spoke, his voice carried the warmth of blood kinship and the respect earned through sacrifice. He said, "Your father would be proud of the man you are becoming." Standing Bear raised his son well, even in exile from his true family. Iris Quaid reached for her baby with tears streaming down her cheeks, but she paused before taking the child from Tobias's arms. Her gratitude went deeper than words could express, carved into the lines around her eyes and the tremor in her voice. She whispered, "You gave him life twice, once with your warmth and once with your courage. How do we repay such a debt?" Tobias looked around the clearing at faces that had transformed from threatening strangers to family members he was only beginning to know. The warriors who had seemed so terrifying in the dawn light now appeared as protectors who had traveled through the night to honor a promise made to his father 15 years ago. The marshal knelt beside Winslow, applying pressure to the shoulder wound while keeping one eye on the traitor's remaining men. Most had fled entirely, but stayed to help their wounded employer, their fight thoroughly beaten out of them by the reality of federal justice. Porter. Dale looked up at Tobias with something approaching fatherly pride in his weathered features. He had seen too many children crushed by circumstances beyond their control. But this boy had risen above his situation in ways that restored faith in human nature. He said, "Son, you've got family here who want to claim you, and you've got legal rights to your father's back wages. Question is, what do you want to do with this new life you've earned?" The baby had awakened in Iris's arms and was staring up at Tobias with dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The child reached out with one tiny hand, fingers grasping, for the boy who had sacrificed everything to keep him warm through the longest night of winter. Sterling Rhodes stepped closer, his eagle feather headdress catching the morning breeze. Around the clearing, his warriors waited patiently for their chief's words, understanding that they were witnessing something that would become part of tribal legend for generations to come. The chief spoke with the solemnity of a man making promises that would outlive them all. He offered Tobias a place among his people, training in the old ways, and the chance to learn about the heritage his father was hidden from him out of love and fear. But even as the offer hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, Tobias realized that his choice would affect more than just his own future. The baby in Iris's arms represented a bridge between two worlds. The decision he made now would determine how that bridge was built and who would be allowed to cross it. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist. With it came the moment when Tobias would have to decide not just where he belonged, but who he wanted to become. 6 months later, Tobias stood at the edge of the same creek where he had found the dying baby on that frozen night.
Out the water ran,
Clear and warm now, reflecting the summer sky like a mirror made of liquid light. In his hands, he held a wooden figure he had carved during the long winter evenings, depicting a boy giving his blanket to a child in need. The decision had been easier than anyone expected when Sterling Rhodes offered him a place among the tribe. Tobias had asked for something different. He wanted to stay at the trading post, now legitimately his through his father's back wages. But he wanted to use it as a bridge between two worlds that had spent too long viewing each other as enemies. Marshall. Dale had helped him establish the place as a neutral meeting ground, where natives and settlers could trade fairly, settle disputes peacefully, and find common ground in their shared humanity. The old building that had once housed Winslow's corrupt business now served as a symbol of justice and reconciliation. Winslow himself had survived his shoulder wound, though he would never regain full use of his right arm. The federal court had sentenced him to 5 years in territorial prison for fraud, attempted murder, and exploitation of native peoples. His hired men had scattered 2 other territories, carrying stories that made other corrupt traders think twice before preying on the desperate. Iris Quaid visited every week, bringing her son to play with the boy who had saved his life. The baby had grown strong and healthy, his laughter filling the trading post with a joy that Tobias had never known was possible. The child had learned to walk by holding on to Tobias's finger, and his first word had been a sound that might have been brother in any language. Sterling Rhodes had given Tobias a new blanket woven by the women of the tribe with patterns that told the story of his father's heroism and his own sacrifice. But the original wool blanket, the one that had started everything, remained with the baby. It had found its true purpose at last. The marshal stopped by every month during his territorial rounds, always pleased to find the trading post operating with the kind of honest dealing that made the frontier a better place for everyone. He had become something like a grandfather to Tobias, offering advice and protection when needed. On quiet evenings, Tobias would sit outside the trading post and carve wooden figures by firelight, each one telling a story of courage, sacrifice, or redemption. Travelers would buy them as gifts for their children, carrying the lessons carved into the wood too. Settlements across the territory, the boy who had once been homeless and forgotten now had a family that spanned 2 cultures, a purpose that brought communities together, and a future built on the foundation of a single act of selfless love. He had learned that family wasn't about blood alone, but about the choices people made for each other when everything was on the line. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tobias smiled and headed inside to prepare for another day of bringing people together, across the divisions that had kept them apart for too long. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and honor collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything too.